So I did write a book called State Food Crimes, and this is a book about food crimes in non-conflict situations. Food crime, state food crime is my own term. I am referring to states that deprive their citizens or those for whom they are responsible of food. And my four contemporary cases, which are the core of the book, are North Korea, definitely a famine situation, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Israeli policies in the West Bank and Gaza, which is a case of heightened malnutrition. I will ignore Israel in this presentation. I'll focus on Venezuela since it's the most contemporary one. I started off, as Alex mentioned, with David Marcus's four categories of intentional recklessness, incompetence, and indifference, and I eventually decided that they all collapsed into each other because every case I dealt with was one of governments that knew that what they were doing, what their policies were doing, was either causing starvation or malnutrition. Also, I'll skip Israel because that comes under international humanitarian law, and I am a human rights specialist. I am not a lawyer. I am a social scientist. I always have to say that. So, Venezuela. You may have been reading in the press about reports of starvation and malnutrition in Venezuela, which used to be a food-sufficient country. Hugo Chavez took power in Venezuela in 1999, and until 2000, he seemed to have improved the living conditions of ordinary Venezuelans. But he did so because he was living off the very high price of oil, Venezuela's major export. Since about 2007, oil prices have declined, and the living conditions have also declined, with very drastic declines since 2003 when Nicolas Maduro took over. I should say here, what I'm going to do is give you some background, some analysis of the causes of the food crisis, what has actually been done, and what could be done to solve this problem. So when I finished the book in 2015, I had found one report of starvation, and I was hesitant to even mention this in my book. I thought perhaps it was exaggerated. Unfortunately, it isn't. Reports are now that most Venezuelans have lost in the recent past between 19 and 24 pounds. 90% say they don't have enough money for food. A year ago, the minimum monthly wage bought 12% of one person's basic food needs for a month. 60% of people are now living in extreme poverty. Some receive subsidized food boxes, but they are insufficient. Their contents are inconsistent. The food boxes are distributed in a discretionary manner and heavily dependent on how you are perceived to vote. Also, diseases like malaria, diphtheria, and dengue are coming back, and infant mortality has been declining between 99 and 2012, it was rising. Between 99 and 2000, it was declining. Now it's rising again. And it seems now that there are hundreds of thousands of refugees. From reports I read, between 1.5% and 2.5% of the population has fled, and they are fleeing because they are looking for food. Up until 2015, they were middle-class refugees coming, especially to the United States. A report of only 8,000. Now we're looking at possibly 800,000 refugees, food refugees. This was perfectly predictable. This is not a surprise. The causes of the food crisis are what somebody called very politely governance failures. I would call corruption and intentional denial. First of all, the destruction of the market economy, running down of oil assets, denial of civil and political rights, and then corruption. So, Chavez introduced control prices for food. Sounds good, but it resulted in underproduction of food when people stopped producing because the prices they received did not meet their costs. also caused, as it always does, a black market in food and corrupt control of distribution. Also, as some foods, more and more foods, were put under control price, the result was that the prices of non-controlled foods rose exponentially. This has been compounded by making the receipt of food packages dependent on political conformity, by expropriations, illegal expropriations of farms and ranches, allegedly because they were unproductive, but not in fact true. Many productive farms and ranches have been expropriated, and there's been very low production on that land after expropriation, as in Zimbabwe. Even food distributors have been expropriated, in fact arrested and tortured for allegedly charging prices above the control price. And there have been enormously high rates of inflation, similar to the extremely high rates of inflation in Zimbabwe up until about 2012. Chavez and then Maduro have run down their oil assets, as I said. One of the things they've done is take money away from the oil company to use for social projects in what one scholar called an off-budget dispensation. In other words, the Chavez and then Maduro get to distribute food as they social resources as they wish. This has resulted in a failure to reinvest in the oil company, and also political appointees, especially military appointees, have been appointed to run the oil company. And the government, instead of selling oil on the international markets, has been giving some to Cuba and to the Caribbean. And you may find this interesting through Citgo, which it owns. It was giving free oil to poor Americans for a while, but it stopped doing that after the oil price fell. It was a propaganda move. All of this has been accompanied by progressive denial of civil and political rights. And that's why I say that I don't think David Marcus's 4 categories work. When they start depriving people of civil and political rights, they know what they're doing. They know that by stopping freedom of the press and freedom of speech and so on, the chances that starvation and malnutrition will increase are higher. So Chavez started by undermining the rule of law, the judiciary, and the role of trade unions, undermining the mass media. For example, it is illegal to post pictures of empty store shelves or images of desperation in Venezuela now on the grounds that it foments hatred, which it may do. The governments have manipulated elections. Maduro has replaced or is trying to replace the elected government by a type of constituent assembly. Government has used torture, abuse, arbitrary use of force, executions, and rule by decree. And finally, corruption. Masses and masses of food, shiploads of food are rotting at the ports because the ports are controlled by men in the military. The longer they sit on the food, the more the price of some food will rise, the more money they'll make out of it. So there's massive corruption going on there, and possibly ties with drug smugglers. Somebody mentioned corruption earlier today. Back in 1985, I suggested an international convention on the return of ill-gotten gains. I'm still suggesting it. I think you should just assume that anybody in government who has more than 100,000 anywhere in any account should just have to give it back to their state. Okay, so what has been done in this matter? Well, the U.S. has started imposing sanctions on particular individuals in Venezuela, from Venezuela, particular members of the government, freezing their assets and imposing travel bans, and also prohibiting financial dealings by U.S. citizens with certain Venezuelan entities. It appears that this may have been, in fact, a Republican tit-for-tat when Obama opened up travel to Cuba. Some Republicans forced him to impose these sanctions in Venezuela, but Trump has been increasing them. These are not, however, violations for violations of food, the right to food, there is such a thing, but for violations of civil and political rights. Ernesto Rodriguez in Foreign Policy sorry, I just don't know his first name, has argued that this is unwise. He says that Maduro was democratically elected, and 25% of Venezuelans still support him, and that if the U.S. is going for regime change, the result will be that the military will take over. He also argues that even targeted sanctions harm entire populations because the government then finds it more difficult to obtain funds to import food. I'm not sure that I buy that one, because food is coming in, but then it's held up and distributed on a corrupt basis and so on. In general, he says sanctions don't work without a carrot as well as a stick. I would add to this that the U.S. has a very long history of imperialism in Latin America, in Chile, in Argentina, in Central America. Maduro draws on that rhetoric to reject any U.S. moves for sanctions. And he also mentions U.S. support for a coup, an attempted coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002. So this makes it very difficult. Rodriguez's argument is that the U.S. should support Venezuelan immigrants to the U.S. and other countries, as should the UNDP. There have been some regional pressures. Some leaders from Venezuela have been barred recently from visiting other Latin American countries. Peru withdrew an invitation to the 8th Summit of the Americas in 2018. The Organization of American States has also approved similar resolutions and has also issued reports on violations of civil and political rights. It has been very tactful in doing so and refers to international law. But the result was that Venezuela withdrew from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 2012. Also, Venezuela still has Latin American allies. There is a populist leftist strain in Latin America, and the countries to whom it gives cheap oil, especially in the Caribbean and Cuba, are very strong allies of Venezuela still. Venezuela has been a party to the International Criminal Court since 2002. And in February of 2018, the prosecutor opened a preliminary investigation into alleged violations using detention, arbitrary detention, torture, and use of force. But again, these are not violations of the right to food. These are violations of civil and political rights. We also know that there's been recommendations that North Korea be recommended to the ICC, but we know that North Korea has the bomb, so that's the short answer to that one. So where do we go from here? And I was thinking of human rights law rather than international humanitarian law. Venezuela signed the optional protocol to the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 2012, which allows individuals to make complaints to UN committees. But it hasn't ratified that. And in any case, those committees don't have much power. They can make recommendations and they can name and shame states. There is a recommendation from people like Manfred Novak for a World Human Rights Court, which would hear individual as well as state complaints against states, and where individuals would have the right to effective remedy. So you couldn't get your president thrown in jail, but you would have a right to remedy. But this is long in the future. Mark Gibney suggested in the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs in 2002 a court in which an individual could sue a government or government agent civilly, bypassing sovereign immunity. He recommended this for torture, but it could also be applied to deliberate deprivation of food. But again, this is long in the future. So the problem is here. This is all post hoc. There is no mechanism to stop perfectly predictable state-induced food shortages before they happen. There's no early warning system that I know of for a government policy that is going to cause a shortage of food. I'm not talking about famine here. I'm talking about food shortages and malnutrition. Plus, you can only try individuals. You cannot try entire governments, even if the entire regime is responsible, as in the case of Zimbabwe, North Korea, and in Venezuela. Even if all the people in the government are complicit, it's an individual, as it was at Nuremberg. There was a mention of the idea of de-recognizing states, but it's really de-recognizing regimes that you want to do. You want to be able to condemn an entire regime and say, you guys are all criminals. And you can't do that yet. So human rights law is inadequate. Somebody said sovereignty is the business of the people who live in a country. It isn't. It's the business of the elites that run the country, most of the time. States, with the exception of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, states have the sovereign right to violate all human rights. They also have the sovereign right to choose whatever so-called development policy they want, and claim that right in the name of self-determination, even when that so-called development policy, as in the case of the Great Leap Forward, the case of Venezuela now, is going to undermine people's rights to food. So there's no external checks to speak of on these rights so far, which are sacrosanct, the right to violate rights. And so we have to sit and watch while people, as in Venezuela, progressively starve. Thank you.